Hey, Jodi, it's so good to see you. Thanks for doing this.
Hi, Whitney.
Would you introduce yourself for those that might not know you? Give a little background of who you are.
Yes. Hello, everybody. My name is Jodi Timmersman, and I live in Duluth, Minnesota, along the shores of Lake Superior. I grew up in Nebraska and Minnesota and lived a little bit in Wisconsin when I was a kid as well. Born and raised in the two by twos, couple generations deep for the family. And I appreciate the opportunity to share a little bit of my story and experience here in Minnesota. We worked really hard to try to get a policy put in place after all of the news of Dean Brewer came to light. So I'm excited today to share a little bit about what that was like from my perspective.
Yeah. Well, and that's why I'm so excited to talk to you because we worked together a little bit at the very beginning of the crisis in Minnesota, especially with the workers there. And I knew how hard you worked. I know the effort you put in a little bit, but I'd like to learn more. I'd like to hear about how that went and your experience with how the policy played out.
Yeah, well, I'm here to share a little bit more about that. Initially, when all of this news broke, I didn't know what to do or what to say. So I just kind of jumped right into advocacy and learning. So to provide context a little bit for how I approached the need to have a policy here in the state of Minnesota, and my vision was broader, was the world. We should all be protected and kept safe. So I first want to back up a little bit though and share a little bit about my lived experience being raised in the two by twos and share a little bit of my story because that shapes how we view things like the need for policies. And I'm going to read from my notes a little bit just to make sure that I don't miss anything. And I've documented things as they happened as we start moving into policy development. And so I want to make sure that I do justice to the little details that I don't want to forget. So here we go. I was raised going to the meetings and continued going to the meetings regularly through my early 30s. I professed when I was 10 years old at Hector Convention. I often going to school felt very different and that I didn't quite fit in. But I thought that that was just my burden to bear so I could be a part of God's kingdom this one true way. I really bought into the exclusive mindset. And as I got older, I met a lot of godly people, and I had a hard time believing that the meetings were the only one true way. And I no longer subscribed to some of the beliefs and the traditions. However, I still felt like it was the right way for me, is how I would word it. I wouldn't say, I don't think that these other people aren't saved. It's just I was too scared to try out what these other ways of worship might look like. So I see now that I was staying in the church largely out of fear, even though my convictions didn't necessarily align with the beliefs of the two by two church as a whole. So once the news of Dean Brewer hit, the thought of leaving the organization didn't occur to me at first. And instead, I felt like it was my opportunity, it was my calling to make positive changes within the organization to make it a safer and inclusive environment. So currently, my career, I work as a social studies teacher. I teach middle school global studies, and I get to teach kids about the world, both the good and the bad. And it's not my job to teach them what to think, feel, and believe. I tell them that frequently. However, it is my job to give them resources so that they can make informed decisions. So this is the lens for which I approach the goal of education for the two by two community. I really thought education was going to be important as we move forward from Dean Brewer. As we, always say, those who don't learn from the past are condemned to repeat it. Just really trying to learn from what we saw happening and all of the outpour of this crisis that we saw, that like we need to do something about this. And so I often tell my students that they can be the change. So even if they feel like it's something small, I talk about the ripple effect, that even a small stone can cause a ripple. So I just really thought that I could just be my little ripple here, and I could get involved with all these people that were also wanting to be an advocate for change. And so that's the lens for which I approached the policy, that I thought if there's enough people advocating for these healthy changes, we can keep people safe and we can start creating spaces within the church. And I would be able to continue to raise my children in this way. So education was really pivotal for me to be able to process the instances of CSA within the two by two. So an example of that would be getting the opportunity to take Ministry Safe. As soon as that course was available for like the general congregation, not just ministers or elders, I took the course shortly after it was opened up just to the general congregation here in Minnesota. And I took the course just right after my parents did as well. So we ended up processing together a lot of what we saw in the Ministry Safe course. And we ended up talking about how there certainly had been many workers in our home that had a lot of these red flag behaviors that were addressed in the course. And we processed the actions of one male worker in particular, and definitely came to realize that his actions were grooming our entire family. And then that led into the realization that his actions actually that included a instance where I was molested by this worker. And that took me a few months to process. That was a lot for our family to sort through how it happened. And these are things that were just so quick and covert, and we didn't recognize it for what it was. So Cynthia Lyles at this time was really instrumental in helping me recognize what happened as abuse. And then I also got connected with a local program to aid victims of sexual assault here in Duluth. It's called PAVSA. And they supported me as I made a police report back in my county that it happened in. And then I also had a subsequent FBI interview. So I thank education for that, because that's really what got the ball rolling and me recognizing how the systems that we were raised in can enable behaviors that are not acceptable. So I partnered with that center, PAVSA, and they also have a program called First Witness here to provide free training for any 2x2 members who wanted to attend. So we rented a hall that could fit up to 300 people, and we put out flyers and advertised it. And I had visions of grandeur with this, and there were about 30 people that attended. So that took some wind out of my sails, because I just felt at this point, people have to realize, and we need to get the word out so that everyone can see what is happening here. And at that time, my husband and I had sent out letters to elders, former workers, former elders we had had, and just a lot of people we felt close to within the church. And with the intention to raise awareness and the need to draw attention to how our culture within the organization was enabling abuse. And we were largely just met with silence and a lot of unreturned emails. That also took some out of us, just because I was really disappointed with that. I was expecting there to be more outcry, more outrage, and to be met with silence was something that was really, really difficult, especially from people that we didn't expect that out of. So that was really tough, especially coming forward within my own situation of abuse that occurred. You just kind of expect different, and that's where we could get into then the cultural part of it that a lot of people weren't willing to talk about. So when we were looking at this with education, I wanted to share today just some statistics that I think really shows that we need to be aware, and we need to have this education to understand the scope of sex abuse in churches in general. So statistics that we've learned are staggering. So I have some citations I can give you from where these things are that we can put in the notes. But here's some from a few different sources: that 50% of pastors look at porn regularly. Pornhub, a popular porn website, reported 2.14 billion visits, which is more than Netflix, TikTok, Instagram, and Pinterest combined. And it is the fourth most visited site in the United States, behind Google, YouTube, and Facebook. The average age of porn exposure is between 9 to 13 years old. And a study by the Barna Group in 2023 showed that about 67% of Christian pastors report having struggled with pornography. 54% of practicing Christians report viewing pornography. And 81% of pastors believe their churches are not adequately teaching about or addressing compulsive sexual behavior. So although these statistics apply to churches broadly, the insular nature of the 2x2s and the fact that our ministry stays within our homes, coupled with the fact that there's no policies in place, compounds this issue that we're seeing nationally, globally, and can make instances of abuse in this organization a lot more rampant, especially as we discovered as we were trying to talk about it and raise awareness and get policies put in place. We were met with a lot of resistance. And to me, that feels really unsafe. especially when you look at the statistics of what is the reality of even Christian believers in this world, that there's a lot of things that we're exposed to, and not being able to talk about it, not having the necessary education will just simply allow for unchecked abuse to occur. So at the time where I was learning in and taking all of this information in, I started getting connected with a lot of like-minded advocates through CCF, Connected Concerned Friends. If you're not on it or you're looking for community, I highly recommend people joining this group. And I moderated on that app for about a year and really got connected with some people. And it was really a lot. It took a lot of time, but it was truly, again, like I said, I felt called to do it. And it was something that I felt like I could do, something tangible to help raise awareness and process through everything that a lot of people were collectively going through at the time and still are going through. So at that same time, I have some friends here where I live where they had a sex abuse crisis at their church here in town, and it made a lot of our local news. And I started talking to them about the abuse crisis we were going through as well. So with that, I learned a lot about what their church was doing to also handle their situation that they had going on. And I heard about this organization called Grace. And this organization was helping their church with reporting to law enforcement, helping them with transparency, policy making and review, and then also with circling back to the congregation and rebuilding trust. So it was really interesting to see that happen in my local community. And that involved people that I worked with, that involved people that I hang out with socially. So it was a really big deal in our community. And to me, I felt like it was a no-brainer that we could also use an organization like that to help us form a policy. So through CCF, I was in contact with people across the country and the world who were interested in creating a child safe policy. And I thought, let's go for it. Let's try it. So on July 5th, 2023, I scheduled a Zoom meeting with 2 people from Net Grace, and we had multiple workers on this call, as well as friends from Minnesota, Texas, Nebraska, Colorado. There was somebody on there from South Africa. We have been connected with people in a few countries in Europe. And there was a consultation that we had with some friends also in the West Coast and the Northwest that also had contacted with Grace. And so together we had this call, we shared resources, and we started thinking about what could we do to move this forward. And after that initial meeting where we got a lot of information, a lot of feedback, kind of a skeleton of what we can do moving forward, we had a follow-up interest group meeting on July 10th. And the main thing there was just to discuss a central entity for billing and to address how to fund policy consulting and investigations. There's been a few situations here in our region where some felt like it was necessary to have an investigation into something by a unbiased third party. So as we were talking about how we could potentially use Grace and hire Grace throughout the summer, I talked to a lot of different workers and friends about the solutions and logistics for hiring Grace. The biggest hurdle of it all for hiring Grace was that there's no central entity for them to bill or no central entity to hire Grace as an organization. So that was the main hurdle of it all, is that as we were talking to them, me as a person of the congregation can't just hire them on my own. So the nature of the setup of this organization made it really tough. And I was assured, as I was talking to various workers, that there was money to cover the cost of Grace within the Minnesota and Iowa funds. And there was no clarity of how much money there was or who controlled that money, but that there was money. And we're talking tens of thousands of dollars. That to me also was a red flag, and also encouraging, like, we have this, like, we can do it, but the money's there. It's not something that we have to like crowdfund from the get-go. And I want to point out at the same time, I received numerous emails from friends who had been on those calls or who had heard about possibly hiring Grace and were willing to crowdsource to hire them. And, you know, they were offering just whatever donation they could afford. And so to me, that made me feel really validated that this was something people supported, and also made me feel guilty, feeling like we shouldn't have to take these people's hard-earned money when there's money sitting over here that can be spent to hire them. And I'm being told that the money is there, but that's not known within the larger community as a whole. So that was something interesting to navigate as well. So there was times throughout that summer and into the fall that I was asked, especially on CCF, once in a while I would hop on and provide updates about where we were at on a policy. And I continued to try to send emails to the groups of people who were really interested in working on this and to get updates on that progress. So it was about that time then that Titus Lehman came on staff in Minnesota from Colorado, and things started to feel a lot less supportive, and communication started to dwindle quite a lot. And so around convention time that fall, I had learned that there was a group of friends and workers who were consulting with Grace about policy writing, and I had been left out of that conversation and not asked to be a part of it at all, despite my heavy advocacy of hiring that organization. So I was at Eagle Bend, and that's where I found out about it and was like, oh, okay, well, maybe it's a good thing. I'm back to school. I'm working full time. I'm a mom to 3 children, that maybe this is a blessing in disguise. But a part of me surmises that I was deemed no longer worthy or maybe credible, as we had started distancing ourselves from the church. I had started wearing pants to some meetings. I had gotten my ears pierced. And although that was never explicitly stated to me, that's some of what I made up about the way I was treated and received after making some changes to my outward appearance. And I was no longer in the group then talking to Grace. So a little while later, there was another email that had asked for people to be a part of a review team. So there was a group of 4 workers and 4 friends who had consulted with Grace, and they were going to put together a policy, and then people would be allowed to provide feedback. So I thought, absolutely, I would love to provide feedback. So that meeting was held on December 12th, 2023. And so there was about 27 people on that call. The initial team of four friends, 4 workers who did the consultation with Grace, and then a bunch of other friends who wanted to provide feedback. And we had all gotten a draft of this policy, and we were able to review it. And then we were coming together to talk about it. So that meeting started, and there was a lot of people providing a lot of really good feedback on what was received. And that included cross-referencing with a policy that a child safe task force had written. And there was a lot of asking for clarity around some of the recommendations Grace gave about having a safeguarding team and such. And then a lot of clarity around, well, how would we take the action steps that Grace recommends and apply it to our situation, the makeup of our congregation, etc. So there was a lot of productive conversation, and I am thankful that there was those people who were willing to work with it. The time spent by that team, although my feelings were a little hurt that I was cut out of the conversation, I, in the long run, was super thankful that there's a lot of time and energy and heart put into that policy, and that group of people who consulted with Grace were doing it because they care. So I don't mean to undercut the work that they did. So we're sitting there talking, and a lot of the people on the consultation teams were just sitting back and were quiet. And it was more of a space for others to give feedback, not for them to, refute anything that was in the policy. So they were just taking a stance more of listening in this meeting, where there was a lot of people who were talking. And there was a point where the meeting completely shifted. And it was when Titus commented, why can't we just use Matthew 18 as our policy? And at that time, the meeting shifted from being a productive conversation of people, recommending policy, to just jumping into trying to defend the need for a policy in the first place. And so it took a bunch of steps backwards. So it felt really off base for him to comment, as at the time he was overseas and had been uninvolved in the policy making process pretty much up until that point. And so then it turned into a defense for, this is why we should have a policy. And people stepped in and said things like, this is a natural problem. It needs a natural solution. This isn't spiritual. We're dealing with matters of the law. And that's why we need a policy, because this is legal. And sex abuse is a crime. child sex abuse is a crime. And a lot of the past practices, when we've been hearing all of these survivor stories that people have been so brave in coming forward with, it becomes glaringly obvious that our past practice was not victim-centric at all, and more abuse-centric and further perpetuating people's trauma. Scripture has been used to enable and cover up abuse in our fellowship. So Matthew 18 hasn't worked thus far as a policy. So other things that he then said was, why do we need rules if we are in a spirit-led faith? And he said we shouldn't have rules. However, when someone brought up that we have many unwritten rules, Titus asked if our policy could just be like that then, some of our many unwritten rules. And those were a lot of the things that at that time then I was challenging, because I felt like there was a lot of things that we had done that weren't based in scripture. And so that also felt kind of like a punch in the gut when it talks about policy and keeping kids safe, to just be unwritten. And that's not prioritizing the safety of the congregation. So he had stated how we can't be lawyer, judge, jury, and that the policy, having a policy, reporting, being really transparent with perpetrators toes the line of putting friends in the place of lawyer, judge, and jury. And that statement was again refuted by some on the call, saying that a policy is very different than playing judge and jury because it makes a clear expectation and holds each other accountable. And it was also brought up that the justice system often doesn't serve justice in situations of child sex abuse and sex abuse because of the lack of evidence. So it was suggested that it is our responsibility as members of the congregation and fellowship to help victims feel safe, because we can't guarantee that the justice system will. And I can vouch for that. Even in the situation I reported, there's nothing that can really be done about it at this point. So also the statistic here, there was an investigation in January of 2025 that less than 4% of sex crimes results in a conviction. So that was also substantiated in the training that we had here in the Northland by PAVSA, that there's just a lot that even them as a resource for victims of various sex crimes, that often the legal system is limited in what they can do. So therefore, then what is our responsibility as people of different things we can do that is within our parameters of control? And I felt again that having a policy would be one of those things. So part of the policy that we were promoting called for background checks and references for people who would be traveling and staying in people's homes. So for sure, workers. Also, we would have included elders in that as well. And Titus said that they call around instead to vet workers and elders. So it was then pointed out that that hasn't worked very well because there have been perps moved around and that not been communicated to members of the congregation. And I chimed in to say that this isn't really any different than what I have to do as an educator, that I go through fingerprinting, I've been background checked, and even anyone who wants to come volunteer in my classroom has to go through a background check procedure. And that's a minimum, something that we could expect for our elders, our workers, and people that we would be inviting into our homes, not just for a meal, but for overnight, which gets a lot more intimate than maybe meeting out for dinner at a restaurant or meeting with your pastor in a church building. This is a intimate fellowship where we are invited into each other's homes, and that's a measure of safety that we could at least expect out of one another. So in this meeting, Titus mentioned some other things as well. And some of his points were, how do you enforce a policy when we're dealing with people's private property? And that was a point of concern that he brought to the table. How do we enforce a policy when the law didn't convict somebody and they've maybe paid for their crimes? Maybe they did do some time in jail and now they're out. How do we enforce policies with people in that situation? And he felt like he needed to speak for some of the friends who said that they don't want a policy or they don't want our fellowship to get caught up in rules. And so he felt really torn, it sounded like, in the call. And he mentioned some instances where he felt like a situation with the perpetrator had been handled well. And at that time in the meeting, then there was a lot of disagreement onto had it been handled well, had it not. And then that was the perfect time then to bring up that a policy would take out the subjectivity of that it could create continuity, it could create safety, and what one perceives as handled, another could perceive it as not. And that would be the benefit of having an organization like Grace, as they are a third party and they wouldn't have conflict of interest, they wouldn't have bias, and therefore would be really beneficial. And it wouldn't be making members of our congregation investigate one another, because we know that that's unethical at best. So, so at this point of the meeting, it had pretty much stalled out. And it was pretty clear that there would be no proactive policies moving forward from the conversation that was happening. And there's a lot of people just kind of skirting around what was going on. So at this point, I finally asked Titus point blank directly, I'm hearing you suggest that we use scripture instead of a policy. You question how a policy will be enforced. And in order for an effective policy, we need buy-in from the fellowship. And I explained to him how his voice amplifies a lot louder than mine. He's in a position of power. He is an overseer. And I asked him point blank, will you publicly support this policy and help enforce a policy suggested by this Grace leadership team? And at that time, he did not reply. He did not say yes, nor did he address the question at all that I had just posed to him. And the call ended very shortly after that. So the next day at work, my phone was buzzing all day. And people were saying, I can't believe you said that to Titus. I can't believe you stood up to him. And it was just odd, because there was a lot of people in that meeting who didn't feel at liberty to turn on the microphone or to speak. And there's a red flag as well, where I'm like, Titus, we're just people, and you can hold this opinion and I can hold this opinion, and his doesn't hold more value than mine. And so I felt pretty heartbroken after that, pretty dejected a little bit that this was not going to happen. I had lost all faith that a policy was going to happen here in Minnesota and Iowa. And there was a lot of people holding out hope that if we could do it here, then other places could piggyback off of it, because we at the time had a pretty unique leadership situation with some of our workers forming a team rather than having an elder. And that kind of ended when Titus came into it back to the state. And so there's a lot of people holding off to see what we were going to do, and if we could get something, and then they would be able to adopt it from there for their region. And, with the long overarching vision being something that this should be nationwide, extend into Canada. There was a lot of people in Canada who were really wanting to adopt something similar, and then beyond. So effectively in one call, all of those hours and the money spent to try to create that policy and that safe congregation just went up in smoke.
Yeah. I remember when that next morning logging into CCF and hearing how the call went, because there was so much momentum going into that call, into that day. There was so much hope about, like, here we are, we're now reviewing and giving feedback on this policy. And then that next morning, it's just feeling devastating.
Yeah. That night after the call, I went to my computer and I wrote up exactly what happened and how I remember it. I had taken notes throughout the call of different things that were said. And so I could remember exactly word for word what was said. And the next day, my phone was buzzing at work all day. People were saying things like, I can't believe you stood up to Titus. I can't believe you said that. And there was just a lot of heartbreak also in those calls. I broke down at school that next day. I went to my counselor's office, who knew a little bit about what was going on, and just cried and cried and cried. And she went in and started teaching one of my classes, because the bells keep ringing on a school day, whether you are emotionally there for it or not. And I collected myself a little bit and had to go back in and teach more classes throughout that day. And it's just heartbreaking to realize that in effectively one call, the effort, the hours spent by that Grace Consult team, the money that had been spent working with Grace, and all of that effort to try to create a safe environment just went up in smoke. It just screeched to a halt.
Yep. The overseer had that much power.
So it was after that call that I had the clarity I needed, that with leadership like that, things just would not change, and that I ethically could not be a part of this organization, nor could I have my own children in this environment. And it affirmed my position of just stepping out of the fellowship a few months prior to this call in December. And it affirmed my position that my time and energy is going to be spent elsewhere where I can affect positive change in the world around me. And part of that is just living the life that Jesus wants me to live. And so I share all this to create accurate context to the things that happened here in Minnesota when it came to a policy. And I've depicted the events today as I recall them and according to the notes that I took them as things were happening. Since that December, it's really been a blessing to see the church as followers of Jesus and get out into the world. And I've been able to experience how people all over are showing their love for Jesus, their love through others, through worship, through discipleship, through love. And it's completely redefined what it means for me to worship, what it means for me to follow Jesus, what it means for me to go to church or to be a part of church. It's been amazing. And one of the first experiences stepping into a church, a worldly church, was I was asked and I said, "What's your policy like?" And I was presented with one. I was explained what would happen to my children, and they love attending church and it feels safe. And I can be assured that if something happens, because we are human and the world is the world and things do happen, there will be a policy to support my children if the need ever arises.
Man, Jodi, I've appreciated you from day one and your passion, both for victims and believing them, but also, like you say, for education, for policy, for common sense guidelines for how to behave as a community of people, and your willingness to put so much time and energy and heart into these issues. Like, this was a lot of work and a lot of effort. And I've seen you champion so many of these beautiful causes. And the most beautiful part for me to see is that you're still championing such amazing growth in the communities around you, in your students and in your kids and in your church community. I admire you. Thanks for the work you've done.
Yeah. It wasn't something that I came into thinking it would be that hard. It felt like I can do this. Let me help you. And I felt like I had a skill set to do it. And I think there's a lot of people out there who felt similar too, where they stepped forward, were willing to share their skills, willing to share their strengths, only to have it tapped out.
Yeah. Yep.
I encourage everyone to step into the things that they know what their strengths are, and that there's places in the world where you can step into it and be embraced with fully who you are and loved however you are. And they will embrace your strengths and let you use them for God's good.
Yeah, that is such a good way to put it, because our efforts for good and for righteousness don't have to be continually frustrating, but they can be celebrated, and they can work. And the thing that I find so amazing is not only your willingness to work this hard when the policy was being put into place, but now being willing to talk about it and to share your perspective of what happened. That's an incredibly important part of the story, to make sure that it's not lost to history.
Absolutely. As a history teacher, I agree with that wholeheartedly. We need to talk about it. And, history is told by the people who are telling the story. So, like I said, this is from my perspective, and perspective matters. And I hold truth to the fact that my perspective matters. So thank you for listening.
Absolutely. Jodi, thank you. I hope you have an incredible day.
Thank you.